Hello, folks. Welcome to the lecture theories of international relations. So, folks, we start with a series of schools of thought, which really encapsulates exactly what international relations is and how it really seeks to see and conceptualize the world. These schools exist for various reasons, which we'll get into, and they have their agreements and areas of divergence, and we'll try to look at a little bit of it all. So, just to introduce the field a little bit more generally, international relations, or IR, is the study of how nations, organizations, and peoples interact across borders. We'll look at war and peace, trade and cooperation, power and justice, and we'll constantly kind of reflect on this fact that there's no one ruling authority for any of it, and how that situation, which we'll call anarchy, really ends up defining our international order. So, rooted in history and philosophy, IR blends political science, economics, and sociology to explain these different patterns and choices that we're making globally. So, the field asks these enduring questions, which we'll try to tackle throughout the next bit of time we have with each other. Why do states fight? How can peace be sustained? And who truly shapes the international order we inhabit? So, why do we have so many schools of thought? We're only going to look at four of them, kind of the four dominant ones of our and some past eras, but there's actually quite a few more that we could have zoomed in on. So, why are there so many different ways of thinking about the world? Well, they emerge because scholars prioritize different aspects about the world. As you'll see, we'll start with power, and we'll talk about that in both economic and military might, cooperation between nations, identity, or inequality. So each theory is shaped by the era and the crisis in which it developed. Realism, which we'll look at first, came to us after the World Wars and focuses on power. Liberalism, after peace settlements, really what we get also in response to the Second World War as a preventative measure to prevent a third. Constructivism after the Cold War. We'll also look at what we'll kind of broadly call Marxist and critical theories, which are going to try to respond to this growing gap between wealthy nations and lower income ones. So, competing perspectives persist because no single theory fully captures the complexity of global politics and human motivation. So, like I said before, we go into our different schools of thought. We'll start with something that all of them, to some degree, believe and kind of share: anarchy. Anarchy is the defining condition of international relations, the absence of a central authority above states. We have roughly 195 UN recognized nations, and even though we do have the United Nations, which we will certainly talk a whole bunch about, there is no one to really enforce law and order on those 195 nations. Once we talk about international law, we'll see that it's very implied, almost. It gives us norms, it gives us morals of how we should treat one another, and there are some mechanisms to enforce those laws. But the most powerful nations in particular, and many weaker ones as well, can flout these different norms and regulations and even laws that we put into place and not really have much of a consequence. So, unlike domestic politics, there's no global government to enforce rules or guarantee security. Realists see anarchy as breeding competition and fear. Liberals view it as a challenge that institutions can mitigate, like the UN. Constructivists, who are all about how we kind of think about the world, argue anarchy's meaning depends on shared norms and beliefs, not on any type of inevitability. So, these different theories interpret anarchy in a really different kind of form, and maybe we end up with order, cooperation, or perhaps conflict. But realism is where we will start, where we're very much coming off of these early 20th century conflicts between primarily European nations trying to carve up their part of the globe, since there was no way to really uh, mitigate or stop any of them from expanding or taking territory, let alone the horrific atrocities that occurred against their own people within their borders. We were realists come out of this era gaining lessons primarily from the military field. And that's really what they tried to emphasize. So after the Second World War, realism started to portray international systems as anarchic, with states acting in perpetual competition for survival. So that was the primary lesson they took from the war. If states are going to survive and thrive, then they need to be militarily and economically equipped to do so, because they're in a competition with other countries attempting to do the same, and we're all battling over scarce resources. So, it also conceptualizes human nature as self interested, so governments only really care about themselves, and power is the primary currency of security. When we talk about power, again, for a realist, it's going to come primarily in military might, but there's also kind of economics in the background. You need a strong economic foundation to build up big militaries and sustain them, etc. So, states exist in a self help environment where no higher authority guarantees peace. And this is where realism kind of cast away all of these ideas about morals. Maybe you want to be nice and friendly and kind and work with every country in the world, but at the end of the day, you have to protect yourself because all of those countries could gang up and possibly harm yours. So, out of kind of a strategic necessity, conflict is the number one thing which really guides a realist and what they're most concerned about. It's an enduring feature of world politics rather than an aberration. It can't be eliminated through nations speaking together diplomatically or through institutions like the UN. So, two of the mega thinkers of realism, Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz, gave us this theory of international politics that really defines realism's foundation. Morgenthau emphasized the human ambition and prudence aspect of it, just how human beings themselves are self interested actors, and that ends up kind of translating to self interested governments. America is only working for America's best interest. Canada is only working for Canada's best interest. And they are in perpetual competition, even when it seems like they're working together. While Waltz advanced structural realism, focusing on systemic constraints, or again, this idea of anarchy. The balance of power ensures that no state dominates. And that is one of the keys to realism, the idea of balance. Since one nation starts to get powerful, the nations around them recognize that there's maybe a military buildup in Russia. So, what does the European Union do? They build up their military. And so, the idea being, if everyone is kind of in this perpetual state of uh, preparing to defend themselves, well, no one state ends up dominating them all. So, you end up sometimes with security dilemmas that arise when states' defensive measures provoke fear in others, perpetuating conflict. And it can kind of be a cycle. So you have, again, I'll use my Russia example, the now 3 year war in Ukraine, which for many folks uh, is kind of a prime example of why you need a realist mentality. If Europe is going to protect itself from further invasions, the military needs to be built up. But at the same time, you kind of have the security dilemma. Europe is building up so much of its military might that ends up giving Russia an incentive to keep on building up its military might. So power is both material, and your military and economic goods, and relative, how much power my country has versus your country. And again, we measure this through military strength, geography, and alliances that maintain stability through equilibrium rather than cooperation. So at the end of the day, again, we may want to be very cooperative with our fellow countries, but it's going to come down to military power and the ability to defend yourself potentially. So realism explains the Cold War arms race and modern power rivalries, such as the United States and China's competition for regional dominance. The Cold War is probably the best example of this. Every new weapon system that the Soviet Union developed, the United States needed to develop something similar, better, more of it, stronger, and the like. So states pursue alliances like the North American Treaty Organization, or NATO, or balance against threats rather than ideals. Russia's invasion of Ukraine reflects a realist pursuit of security and influence in its perceived sphere. For Russia, They're trying to either make a buffer between themselves and who they see as their rivals in the West, or they're trying to uh, make annex large portions of Ukraine in order to give Russia more strength, more power. So, despite humanitarian language, realists argue that states intervene abroad only when their interests align, demonstrating that power and security consistently trump moral or ideological commitments in world politics, which is a pretty powerful claim. All of the European democracies have denounced Russia. They've done all types of things to assist Ukraine and indirectly hurt the Russian war effort. But one thing they haven't done is send their militaries into Ukraine to support them. Because even though they may have a moral or ideological commitment, they're only going to militarily intervene if that's in their best economic or political interest. So, we'll get to critiques of each one of these ideas. Critics argue realism overemphasizes conflict, ignoring cooperation, interdependence, and non state actors. Scholars claim its focus on power cannot explain global governance or the diffusion of norms. We still do have some international law that many billions of people live under. We still are able to get institutions like the European Union, which you have over 2 dozen countries that have open borders, a single currency, and they work with each other on military matters. Realism wouldn't exactly predict something like that would even be possible. But realism endures because this anarchic system remains unchanged. From deterrence theory to nuclear strategy, realist assumptions continue to inform national security. The main reason that we end up with realism so often in the Pentagon and other uh, military establishments. So, this, what we'll call geopolitical rivalry, or the ability to kind of economically and politically dominate your geographic sphere, and military buildup in the 21st century suggests that realism's dark vision retains practical and analytical value. So realists sometimes get the bad rap of being the pessimist. They are concerned about conflict beyond all else. So they kind of see the world like this classic film, Dr. Strangelove. A whole lot of military men, primarily, and a few politicians, trying to figure out what the next moves should be around the globe. In reality, though, of course, we do have some institutions that operate something like that, but nothing quite as militaristically as what Dr. Strangelove would have guessed. And again, you still have institutions like the European Union, where no, you don't have an arms buildup between nations. You have really deep and enduring cooperation, integration, and that calls some of realism into question. So, on the other side, when sometimes they get a little bit the rap of being optimistic, you have the liberals. Liberalism emerged from the Enlightenment optimism about human reason and progress. This is not the same way that the United States talks about liberalism. We're not talking about the left wing of the political spectrum, but instead, the idea that all human beings have these faculties of reason, therefore, we can progress into being better beings over time. We are entitled to our natural rights, life, liberty, freedom from oppression. You know? It contends that cooperation, not conflict, is possible, even in an anarchic system. Individuals and states can pursue mutual gains through trade, democracy, and international institutions. So, unlike realism, liberalism views states as interdependent, or they're kind of connected to one another, and capable of restraint. We don't need to always be worrying about military buildups and dominating our geographic area. It envisions an international order built on law, transparency, and collective security, where shared interest and communication reduce uncertainty. So, as long as we have really open institutions where nations can talk and resolve their differences, make laws, agreements, and treaties, then that is the number one way to avoid conflict in the state of anarchy. So, liberalism's key thinkers go way back to the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant gives us a really early idea of what he calls perpetual peace, where he was emphasizing law and republican governance, or what we'll later know as democratic peace theory. Idea of Uh, you have democracy in your country. Well, democracies talk to one another. They have similar ideals. Therefore, they don't fight one another. And you end up circumventing war through the type of government you have internally. 20th century theorists expanded the tradition through institutionalism, arguing that institutions such as the UN and the World Trade Organization make cooperation rational. Concepts like complex interdependence describe how economic ties and shared regimes constrain conflict. Well, if I'm trading with you, if we have the same currency, if we're maybe even using some of the same military equipment, if our people speak similar languages or each other's languages, if we're that integrated, how in the world could we fight? And that gives us democratic peace theory, which claims again liberal democracies rarely fight one another because of institutional accountability and normative restraint. It is just not in the nature of a democracy to attack another, at least in this line of thinking. So, you kind of have a three-sided pyramid to this idea of peace. You have international organizations which work in a two-way street with economic interdependence, countries being very closely linked through trade and whatnot, all of it being linked together by the common denominator of democracy and free governance. So, at work, liberalism really becomes the basis of the international order after 1945. The realists end up dominating the military aspects of governments. The liberals end up dominating the political ones. So the liberals end up building institutions like the UN, NATO, the Bretton Woods institutions, which, if you don't know what they are, we will discuss them in detail when we get to political economy. They all embody these liberal principles. Cooperation on global health, trade regulation, and climate change reflects liberal assumptions about mutual benefit. The European Union and its integration process demonstrates how economic interdependence in law can overcome centuries of rivalry, or at least we hope anyway. So, all of these different institutions that really shape our modern world come from this liberal train of thought. If we can just keep all of our kind of cards on the table through transparency, we're speaking to each other constantly, our economies, our political systems, even our militaries are intertwined through institutions like NATO. We're simply not going to fight one another. Liberalism helps explain the proliferation of multilateral treaties and transnational networks. So, when shared governance and transparency temper conflict, even between historically adversarial countries, you really start to see liberal theory at work. But of course, it's not without its critics. Realists criticize liberalism for naivete, claiming that trust in law cannot overcome power politics. Marxists, who we'll talk about in just a bit, argue that liberal cooperation masks capitalist domination. So, a group that we won't talk too much about are the post-colonialists, but I still think it's important to put in their critique. They see all of this as Western self-interest, dressed up as universalism. All of those institutions are really just hiding the fact that the United States, China, Europe, and the rest of the victors of the Second World War dominate the planet. Despite recent populist backlashes, liberalism's emphasis on diplomacy, and human rights, and trade continues to guide much of world politics. Certainly, President Trump and many other nationalist political leaders in Europe, aspiring ones anyway, have pushed back against this idea of integration, thinking it's hurt their nations in any number of ways, maybe culturally as different ethnic or racial groups come in, maybe economically as the older industrial base moves out to countries where labor is cheaper. But despite all of that, the global economy is still highly integrated and very much so between democratic countries. But you still have that critique. Liberalism and international law could not stop the invasion in Ukraine. Russia did not care about any of the laws against aggression. So liberalism can be kind of hard to enforce. Also, democratic peace theory has some caveats. This is President Salvador Allende of Chile. He was a democratically elected leader from the 1970s who the United States had overthrown. He was a democratically elected socialist. The government at the time believed he was too far to the political left, and so it sponsors his eventual assassination while simultaneously propping up who's going to become a really vicious human rights violating dictator named Pinochet. So, do democracies really respect one another? For our post-colonial or Marxist thinkers, well, only if capitalism is kind of the common denominator. Next up, we have constructivism, which arose in the late 80s as a reaction to realism and liberalism's focus on materialism. Both of those philosophies are so focused on institutions, military, or economic might that constructivists believe they miss the whole realm of ideas. So it asserts that international reality is not fixed, but constructed through shared ideas, norms, and identities. Anarchy has no inherent meaning. Rather, its consequences depend on how states interpret it. If you see the anarchic world as something very, very frightening, then maybe realism takes over. If you see opportunities to work with your fellow democracies or maybe Islamic states getting together or Pan-Africanism or something like that, then maybe liberalism looks a little bit better to you. For a constructivist, either of those things makes sense. The world is literally what you make it. So human behavior in global politics is shaped by belief systems and collective expectations. Change occurs when shared understandings shift, altering norms that define legitimate action within the international community. We have many key thinkers from this school of thought, such as Wendt, his declaration, "Anarchy is what you make of it," captured constructivism's essence. Other scholars expanded the framework to explore to explore how norms spread and how identities are formed. Constructivists study how concepts such as sovereignty, or the ability of a nation to govern itself, legitimacy, and security evolve through discourse. How do we talk to one another in order to make this world? How do inflammatory comments and speeches from a president end up shifting the way that we think about the world? How can an election or a revolution in a different country completely change our minds on whether or not that nation is a friend or a foe? They emphasize the logic of appropriateness, suggesting states act according to socially accepted norms, rather than purely rational cost-benefit calculations. Language, culture, shared beliefs shape world politics. And I think you can see this at work. Just like realism and liberalism, depending on your frame of reference, you can see this in pretty stark detail. You see this with really different nations, such as, say, Japan and Canada. Why are they working together? Well, they have a very similar economy, a very similar political system. Their cultures can be radically different, but they have the shared norms of democracy. You have something sort of similar in the Middle East, which is beginning to emerge. Security agreements between various Islamic states, which are trying to make their own rendition of NATO or collective security for the whole Islamic world. And even though many of them have been rivals, they have gone to war with each other over the years. You have instances where old foes are becoming friends, and they have the shared identity of being Muslim nations, and that's what brings them together, not these other institutions or just power politics. So constructivism explains shifts in global norms, such as the abolition of slavery, the rise of human rights, the stigmatization of nuclear weapons. All of these things became norms for us. The creation of the International Criminal Court reflects this moral learning and identity transformation among states. We also have today climate diplomacy and humanitarian interventions, which demonstrate how these shared narratives can hopefully generate some form of collective action. Constructivists note that when ideas change, such as redefining security to include the environment, state interests follow, reshaping the very structure of international cooperation. Its critiques, which you may be able to see coming at this point, critics argue constructivism lacks predictive power and overemphasizes ideas at the expense of material constraints. Well, didn't we just take liberalism and realism and turn them on their head? The first two are way too much about institutions and the military or the economy. So now this other constructivist camp is all about ideas. Well, why does it have to be all of one or the other? But its interpretive strength lies in explaining why meaning matters. It illuminates how identities evolve, explaining phenomena realism overlooks, such as the EU's normative influence or global movements for justice. So a really big kind of area of research for a constructivist is digital communication and how it's kind of shaping the way that we talk in a very different manner than it did in the 80s. It offers vital tools for understanding how narratives, from climate responsibility to populist nationalism, transform norms. So, for its critics, well, maybe you're a little bit too in the clouds. You're thinking that the whole world's just about how you conceptualize it or how you share values. Well, sometimes we have shared values because we have wars. We defeated fascism in World War II, and now those shared norms exist because of the result of that conflict, not just because people started thinking differently. And last but not least, Marxism and critical theory. There are a great deal of Marxist inspired critical theories, and so I'm going to try to speak about them kind of broadly, but it's not to say that they can all be broken down into just one school of thought. So, Marxist and critical theories interpret international relations through the lens of global capitalism and class struggle. It's rooted in Karl Marx's critique of political economy, which hopefully you're familiar with. The idea that those who own industry are exploiting the workers who they employ by paying them low wages and demanding a lot of work in Karl Marx's day, dangerous conditions. And this ends up producing a two-tiered society, the haves, the have-nots, and the bourgeoisie, the kind of middle managers in the center. Little crash course in Marxism, but take those same ideas, and now, instead of the capitalist and the worker, you have rich country, poor country. Or the way that we'll talk about it in international relations, wealthy nations, the global core, and lower income nations, the periphery. So, what is international relations about from this perspective? The global core exploiting the periphery. Power is economic before it is military. An international order reflects the interest of ruling classes. So, imperialism, dependency, and commodification, or turning people or the environment into goods to be sold, are seen as structural features rather than temporary distortions. The idea of one nation colonizing the next, well, that's kind of par for the course. Sweatshops, your local factory shutting down, and then a low income worker in a far off nation takes your place. Both workers are kind of hurt in the process, but all of that to a Marxist is par for the course. International relations is about exploitation. So Marx and Engels laid the foundation by linking political power to economic production. Later theorists extended this thought into IR. Vladimir Lenin explained imperialism as capitalism's highest stage. Anytime one nation invades another to exploit it for its resources, you have like a corporate hostile takeover of a small business. Gramsci introduced cultural hegemony as soft power. He was an Italian political theorist who tried to get us to think about the way that the capitalist class makes kind of exploitation normal and how regular old people deal with low wages or bad working conditions as uh, kind of a piece of their culture that just gets hammered into our brains in kind of a propagandistic way. And lastly, Wallerstein's world system theory gives us this hierarchical division of labor between the core and the periphery. So if you put it all together, you have something that looks like this. Your wealthy nations in the dead center of our three-tiered bullseye here are looking for cheap goods, they're looking for cheap labor, and where do they find it? The periphery, underdeveloped nations where people are not earning too terribly much. Then those cheap goods and labor goes into the core in the form of high-cost consumer goods, which then get flown around the world, and the same worker that makes the iPhone in China may not be able to afford that same iPhone when it's sold on market back to them. And this sets us up for what we call the core and periphery today. You have the core being in blue, your periphery being the vast majority of nations in red, or that pink color. Yes, they're lower income, but they're resource and labor rich. So their oil or natural resources can be exploited, so can their people for labor. And then you have those nations that are somewhere in between in the yellow. So, Marxist and critical theories interpret globalization, the theme that we'll continuously come back to, as the extension of capitalist domination through institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and multinational corporations. All of these big systems are just set up to help the core exploit the poor. Debt crises in the global south, resource extraction, labor exploitation, such as so called sweatshops and almost human slavery in some conditions, illustrate this systemic inequality. So, just like the other three theories, you can certainly see this Marxist critique playing out. There is no shortage of very poorly paid and treated workers around the world, typically in those nations that we call the periphery, and they make the goods that get sold here in the core. So movements for fair trade, climate justice, and economic decolonization reflect efforts to challenge the hierarchy. And you really get this kind of anti-imperialist revolutionary mindset that's set in for a lot of folks when they're seeing the IMF or the World Bank come to town, these two big financial institutions made by the United States and its partners, and they resist in any way that they can. But our critics claim Marxist theory oversimplifies human motives and ignores non-economic factors. And now we've come totally full circle. We have kind of the same critique of all of these. All of them are looking at one thing too much. And because they look at just that one thing, none of them are equipped with the ability to tell us everything that we need. But we'll get there in a moment. Marxism's emphasis on inequality, dependency, and exploitation remains deeply relevant, though. With the rise of global capitalism, outsourcing, and wealth concentration validate a lot of these insights. So, with all of these different kind of viewpoints floating around, what we will try to do is keep in mind with each major issue that we're dealing with, how these different schools of thought would actually try to take them on. What would they actually have to say in regards to the contemporary issues, which we'll look at every week in discussions and elsewhere? And by doing so, I think it's going to give us really good insights into how both political scientists and oftentimes leaders of nations and militaries contemplate the world. Thanks for listening.